This talk is about the Woods Bushland Reserve. It's a small remnant adjoining Devil Bend Reservoir right in the middle of the Mornington Peninsula, and it's managed by the Mornington Shire. Walk through here in the day will encounter a wide range of flora and fauna, and at night you explore a whole new world. The presentation is designed to give an overview of what uses the reserve, and it digs a bit deeper into the interplay between the species, particularly through what I've exposed through exploring the small nightlife of the reserve. I'm not so strong on the flora, so we'll stick to what I understand more about, the fauna, and in particular the micro-fauna. The basis for the talk is photos I have taken, so it is not a comprehensive coverage of life in the reserve. This is an eastern yellow robin, and it's a bird that I associate with Woods Reserve more than any other. It doesn't matter when I go, you either see or hear them as a rule. This bird's a predator, and a predator of invertebrates generally, and here it has captured a primary decomposer, an earthworm. It's this interplay between species that I want to explore in this presentation. In order to understand the ecology of a habitat, you first need to understand what species are there and how they interact with other species. And I'm only just going to touch the tip of an iceberg in association with Woods Reserve, but that's the gist of what this talk is about. Now, I said I don't know much about the flora, but it doesn't stop me taking photos of some of the flowers. There's quite a wide range of flowering plants in the reserve, some of which examples are here, but I'm not going to dwell on each of those. I'll push on with the fauna. There's many birds use the reserve, as you might expect. I'm not quite sure how many. There's 92 species recorded on eBird. I've seen probably 50 to 60 species without doing a full total on it. But examples here, crested shrike-tit up in the top left-hand corner, a bird not seen that often. The top right-hand corner are the crimson rosellas, and they're a very common bird, regularly seen in Woods Reserve. The bottom right is the bell miner. Has a beautiful call, but it can be seen to be quite destructive in how it manages its little patch of bush. There's a colony of bell miner on the western edge of Woods Reserve. And on the bottom left is a satella, varied satella, another bird that's not seen very often, but it, like the crested shrike-tit, is exploring the bark for invertebrates. Other life forms that you might encounter there include the koala, which I rarely see during the day, but when I've been there at night exploring the nightlife, you regularly hear them grunting and making a hell of a racket at times. The fungal image of a fungi in the top right corner, there's plenty of different forms of fungi available to find and explore, something I have done very little of, and the reptiles are few and far between. Around the dam, you'll often find dragonflies and damselflies, particularly through the warmer weather. These things are voracious predators in both their aquatic larval stage and as adults. And there's many species of fly. We think of bush flies or blowflies, but there's a whole range of flies that you can encounter at Woods Reserve and other places. They've got roles from predation through of a range of invertebrates to the predatory parasitism of beetles to decomposing dead vegetation. So they take on quite a few roles, and I'll just illustrate that now. Scavenger flies in the Sepsidae family are coprophagus. That means dung eating. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, but they can also eat decaying vegetation, and they help with the whole decomposition of waste. The flies of this genus, Topagista, are commonly seen on a variety of Australian fungi. The males are often seen patrolling or guarding the upper surface, while the female is down underneath, laying the eggs on the pores or the gills. This tachnid fly, this photo was taken by a mate of mine, Bill, but this fly, the genus of this fly are known to be parasitoids of the late instar larvae of scarab beetles, and there's an example of one of the scarab beetles that's found at Woods Reserve on the right. So they feed on each other. The fly lays an egg on the larva, and that larva then becomes the food supply for the fly to develop through its life stages until it emerges from the larva as an adult fly. Robber flies are plentiful. There's a few species of hoverflies out there. The adults feed on pollen and nectar, which they gather from the flowers, while the larvae feed on aphids. And just pointing out here that the pollen that's attached to the fly, this is the way pollination is assisted with a number of invertebrates, be they beetles or flies or moths. So other nightlife forms, when you get there at night, you get a different suite of fauna. The top left is the sugar glider, feeds on the plant exudates, the gum. That one there it's scratched the surface in the bark, and it's coming down, licking up the sap that exudes from there. To its right is a common ringtail possum that feed on the plant material. And underneath that is a powerful owl. I've only seen one in the reserve, but they feed on the two mammals pictured above. They're an apex predator. And in the bottom left is an emerald moth, and that's just an example of the invertebrates that are encountered at night. And the way I encounter them is to go out with a light and an old sheet. And this is what you can find. A whole range of insects and other invertebrates, spiders and mites and the like. It's dominated by moths, but a whole range of other things exist as well. The dominant moth in that image is this spectacular Helena gum moth, which feeds on eucalypts. The larvae grow fairly quickly, but the pupal stage can last from 6 months to several years, so they've got a very long gestation period for an insect. This is just to illustrate a little bit about what's on the sheet. So there's the big moth in the middle. All these yellow circles are around other moths, and then you can see beetles. These, if you can see this little red pointer, several beetles. There's a group of little leaf hoppers, so they're little bugs that suck the sap out of plants. There's caddisfly, lacewings, and a whole lot of other tiny little things that are too small for me to get a photo of that I can identify anything that's in there. So that's just to show you how I've come across these things. Now, everything that I take photos of, I load onto iNaturalist, which is a citizen science platform that enables you to record what's seen in different places, and there's a lot of people on there that will help you with identification. As I say, identifying what species are there is an important first step in understanding the interplay between species. So when I have a look at what I've posted on iNaturalist and has been identified as different species for Woods Reserve, this is the range of things that have been there. And you may or may not be able to see the numbers down the side, but they range from everything's got less than 10 different species except for the moths, where there are 246. And I'll just quickly skim through what these are in terms of examples of each one. So the first one, arachnids, spiders, mites, ticks, that sort of thing. An example here is the huntsman, this badge huntsman spider. They've got flattened bodies, and their joints in their legs enable them to go sideways instead of underneath them, so they can squeeze in under bark and rocks. Now, they eat other insects and various invertebrates, and the name comes from the underside of the abdomen. Over here on the left, you can see this badge appearance that is on the bottom side of their abdomen. Then we go to the Coleoptera, which are beetles, and it's a little surprising in some ways that there aren't more beetles come to the lights, because there's so many beetle species in the insect world. This common eucalyptus longhorn beetle, it's a native of Australia, and it's now present in a lot of other countries. Australia's exported eucalypts for wood and other purposes in other countries, and heading off with the eucalyptus trees has been the common eucalypt longhorn, and it's become a pest of those plantations in other countries. It relies on the same environmental limitations that the tree does, so it's capable of establishing anywhere that the trees are growing. And the larvae make extensive tunnels in the inner bark surface. Then we go to the diptera and the flies. I've already shown a few examples of flies. These are stiletto fly, and their larvae are generalist predators of soil-dwelling invertebrates. They look a little bit like wireworms. The little thin wireworms are yellow with quite a hard surface on them, segmented, and the wireworms have got the 6 legs. They're the larvae of click beetles, but the larvae of these, while they look similar, they are white and they don't have any legs. The Hemiptera as a group are the bugs, and as an example there's this brightly coloured leafhopper, and typical of most bugs, they feed by sucking nutrients. In this case, most of these are sucking nutrients from leaves. Some of the bugs are predators and suck the nutrients from their prey, but most of the ones that I've seen at Woods coming into the light at night have been plant hoppers. The Hymenoptera, ants, wasps and bees. I'm sure there's a lot more of these around than what I've encountered as well. These flying ants are off on a nuptial flight to establish a new colony. So that's what happens when they particular group hatch out, and they have developed huge chests for chest muscles for managing the flight with wings, and they're the ones that set off and must be triggered by a critical mass in the colony, and they head off to establish new colonies. Then we've got the moths, which is a huge sector, and I'll spend a bit more time on that shortly. These cossid moths, their larvae bore into tree trunks as well. We've got lacewings. I'm not quite sure about, it's called a stream lacewing, but I haven't yet worked out, despite that common name, as to whether their larvae are aquatic, semi-aquatic or terrestrial. The Odonata I've already touched on. They're predators in both their larval and adult forms, and so they're generally around their larval stage occurs in the water, all of them, so that's why they're generally found around water, and the dam in Woods Reserve is a good source of dragonflies and damselflies. And the last group is the crickets, the Orthoptera. They eat a wide range of diet, including insect larvae, aphids, flowers, seeds, leaves, fruit and grasses. So, where does this take us to? This is a map of Woods Reserve. This red line around here encompasses the reserve itself. The background to the map is a Mornington Shire map of the ecological vegetation classes that have been mapped out for the peninsula, and it shows those classes for Woods Reserve. The bulk of it is this brown colour, which is lowland forest. Now, this is Woodlands Lane here, and that's where I set up my light sheet. So I'm basically drawing from the lowland forest, essentially. And this is a photo of nearby there, and whilst I admitted at the start I don't know much about the vegetation, I still haven't worked out which of these trees are the messmate stringy bark and which are the narrowleaf peppermint, which are the two main trees in that EVC. So now I'm going to explore with a lot more detail the moth species that I've found in Woods Reserve, and the interplay between them and other invertebrates and the plants and the general ecology of Woods Reserve. So this is a series of families. There's 33 different families that I've had species recorded from at Woods Reserve, and these little lines here are 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 different species for each family. So I'll start looking at the Echophridae, where this little green smiley person is. The Echophridae are small, but they've all got this distinctive palp that turns back up over there. They've got a pair of these. They're modified mouth parts that have been modified. The palps, the maxillary palps, are modified mouth parts that have been turned into sensory organs, and a lot of them give you characteristics of how to identify different moths. So these Echophridae all have these upturned like goat horns almost, and they're very small, remembering that this white check here is an ordinary bed sheet. So because it's got so much, the size of it, you can tell that these Echophridae moths are all pretty small. We'll now have a look at the Geometridae, the next green smiley face. These are the moths that have their wings flattened against the surface they sit on, and you can generally see part or all of the hind wing. So they sit flat on the surface, and they've got you can generally see their hind wings as well. We then go up and have a look at the Tortricids. These have got just a little tufted head. There's no protruding obvious palps, and they've all got this typical shape though. They're pretty much flat but slightly tent shaped, and I'll show you some others after that. This is quite a bell shape when you look at it from above. Now I'll look at these two as a pair, the Pyralids and the Crambidaes, because they're both part of a superfamily called the Pyraloideae, and I'm really not quite sure why these ones the Pyralids are separated from the Crambids. But what all the Pyraloideae have are these protruding palps sticking out the front. So this is the Pyralids, quite colourful, and this is the Crambids with these palps that stick right out the front. These are the little webworm moths that you often see around grass. They flit around and go and land on something, a piece of grass, and they just seem to disappear, because folding their wings up like that, they just disappear against the stem of the grass. This pair are similar to the last. This is the noctoids, and these are the Erebid moths, Erebidae. They're both part of the superfamily Noctoideae. And again, I'm not really clear on the reasons for separating out these species. With moths, one of the things is that a lot of the separation of genera and species and families is not due to the morphology of the adult moths. It's due to the larval stage and the characteristics and features of the larva. And that's why it's a bit tricky to understand why some are put in one group and not another, because most of the time you're just looking at the adult moth, and so you miss the distinction between the species from the larval stage. So the Erebids, again, have no prominent pulp features. They're generally flat. The wings are flat, and they've generally got a bit of colour about them and fairly broad. They don't roll themselves up like the Crambids do. And if we go to the noctoids, this is the group that we see very well camouflaged, the bogong moth, the southern armyworm. A lot of the crop pests are part of this group here. Fairly nondescript, a lot of them, these markings are very subtly different, and it's quite difficult and challenging to identify the noctoids at times. So now we leave all that general introduction, and the rest of it's going to be about individual species and what they do and where they sit. So this is a bracken moth, and unsurprisingly, the bracken moth larvae feed on the bracken fern, and there's plenty of bracken fern in the understory of Woods Reserve, so no doubt there's plenty of these moths around. The common heath moth, as its name indicates, these feed on Epacorus genus plants, which is the common heath, Epacorus impressa. Forgive me for my pronunciation of these Latin names. Are present in Woods Reserve, so my assumption is that these moths feed on this plant. This is the same moth as that one, it's just that it's been photographed in flight when the forewings are still forward and have exposed the brightly coloured hind wing. The native cranberry moth also feeds on the common heath, and as well as the common heath, it feeds on cranberry species as well. This is a cup moth. I've called it the orange cup moth, but it's one of the species, a number of species of cup moth that are very hard to separate just from photos. You need to have them under a microscope to be able to separate the species. But these defoliate eucalypt trees by eating parts of the plant and leaving the skeletonized style parts. The larvae have little prongs on them that when they're agitated they stick them out, and they've got some poison glands in them. Now, I've got the crimson rosellas there because I've read that they feed on the larvae of some of these cup moths. Now, I'm not quite sure which species they feed on, and I don't quite understand how they handle these little poisonous spines, but that's my understanding. Rosellas, of course, most of the time are just feeding on seeds. This is a gumleaf skeletonizer, which are fairly widespread, and they have eruptions of huge numbers sometimes, and completely, they look like they've destroyed the trees and whole forests at times when they get really prolific. They lay their eggs in a series of parallel rows, and when the larvae hatch, for a start off they just all sit together on the same leaf, like shown in this picture here, and just graze away together. Then as they mature, and go through their instars, they start separating out and going to their own particular leaves. But they eat the fleshy part of the leaf and leave all the oil glands and the veins, and that's where you get this skeletonized appearance. And like a few other moths, for some reason, the larvae tend to, as they grow, they fill out their skin, and then they have to break out of that skin, have their new skin until they grow, until it can no longer fit in that, and then they have to break out of that skin, go into the next instar of their larval stage. For some reason, these ones keep the head shell of each of the previous larval stages. So this one here has had at least 3 larval stages because it's got 3 of its hats still sitting up above its head. This is a butterfly, not a moth, but it came to the light at night. They're not recorded very often, but I'm sure they're not that rare. It's a moth whose larvae feed on mistletoe. It's the only one of the species that I've recorded here that I understand feed on mistletoe, but it's quite interesting for it to come to the nightlight as well. So while we're on butterflies, another butterfly that there's quite a number of butterflies out there at Woods Reserve. This one's the Australian painted lady, and it feeds on the everlastings, daisies, yellow buttons, etc., as well as the introduced capeweed and lavender plants. Interestingly, I found out with this is that they only have 4 working legs. Like all insects have got 6 legs, and they have got 6 legs, but the front 2 have evolved to become just vestiges of their earlier function. They just sit and hang down the front of the thorax, and their feet have been exchanged for specialised scales that form some form of sensors that are sensitive to something. I'm not sure of what it is, but I wasn't aware that they only had 4 working legs. These next 2 slides are of 2 moths of the same genus, and I've just got them here to illustrate how important it is to understand the individual species that you're dealing with, because they live 2 quite different lives. This first one is the Aerococcus moth, and the larvae feed on these gumleaf scale. This image is not mine. It comes from the website Insects of Tasmania, which is a fantastic resource for finding out about insects of Tasmania, but a lot of them are common to southeast Australia as well. Now, these scale live in the little cocoon type things, and they obviously exude something that the ants get benefit from, and therefore the ants then give them some protection. But clearly the larva of the Aerococcus moth can penetrate that because that's what they feed on. And this little picture over here is just of a scale taken from a bush here at home. It's not those scale, but just to illustrate what the animal itself looks like. This is lying on its back with its legs sticking up in the air. Just a little round ball of food resource, I guess. So this is another Stathmopoda moth, and you can tell it's very similar. It's got the same sort of shape and similar patternings. But unlike the previous one, this species, it's much more common than the Meloocra, Stathmopoda Meloocra, but these feed on the leaf litter of eucalypts. So rather than feed on the scale that the last one did, these feed on leaf litter. And this illustrates why it's so important to understand what the species are in order to understand and appreciate their role within the ecology of wherever you're looking at. This one has got a number of moths that are feed on nectar and assist in pollination. So this is a burnet moth, this one down the bottom middle, And I'll just have a think about the colours of this, the orange thorax and head, black with black and white abdomen and the dark wings, because I'll come back to it later. This is one of the day-flying forester moths, and this is one of the noctoid moths. And while they can't actually eat pollen because of their proboscis is too fine for them to do that, as I said earlier, like the hoverfly, they can collect pollen on the hairs of and scales and transfer it from one flower to another. This slide is just of a series of echopherid moths. Now, it's just to illustrate the broad range of colours and shapes. Not so much size, because they're all pretty small, but about 80% of these echopherids, these are the most populated family of Woods Reserve. 80% feed on the Myrtaceae, and 70% of them feed on eucalypts, and about half of them feed on dead leaves. There's very few that actually feed on acacia. But there's some really striking, this little moth here is a striking little moth when you see it. It's very, very small, but these patterns are really quite terrific to look at. Now, this is from the same superfamily as the echopherids, but it's from the family Cosmopterigidae, and it's very close to, like all these ones within the same superfamily, they're all very similar. So it's got the same upturned palps, maxillary palps, that I talked about with the echopherids, but most of these feed on acacia. So while very few of the echopherids feed on acacia, most of the Macrobathra feed on acacia. And this is another family from within that same superfamily. You can see very prominent palps coming back over the top of their head. These also feed on acacia, and they're from a different family again. And these are tortoisids that I told you about earlier, the bell-shaped ones. You can see that bell shape much more clearly here. Reasonably well flattened, but you don't see the hind wings like a geometrid. You just see the forewings. And they've got a lot of, they can be quite hard to separate sometimes as well, because a lot of these patterns are quite similar between them. But the larvae of these are decomposers of dead vegetation. So they're a really important part of churning over the nutrients and making the nutrients, the pathway to making the nutrients available to new plant life to grow again. And while we're talking of decomposers, the millipedes are classic. They're absolutely designed to be able to push their way through the rotting vegetation, and they're a powerful decomposer themselves. This is actually an introduced species of millipede. These are fascinating little things that I've only seen from Woods Reserve. They're called harvestmen, opiliones, and they're omnivorous. So they eat a whole range of insects and spiders and mites and plant material. They can be scavengers and they can be predators. So they've got 8 legs, so superficially they're like a spider, but they've only got 2 eyes. And while they do have a cephalothorax, that like the front part with the breathing part, and an abdomen, the way they're joined together, it looks like they've only got one section. But they're non-venomous. This little beetle's quite interesting. It's called an ant nest beetle, and that's primarily probably for its overseas life cycles. There are a number of these ant nest beetles that live almost entirely within the confines of an ant nest. But in Australia, there's very few specimens that the species that have been collected from ants' nests. Most of them are collected from out and about underneath bits of bark and rock and the like. So maybe the Australian suite of Arthropterus are different to some of the international ones. But fundamentally, we know very little about them. So the issue with these is that we need to understand more about their biology, and any sort of study and observation of their biology will add greatly to our knowledge of these rare beetles. Now, this braconid wasp is one that moves up and down the trunks of trees. The females have got a large ovipositor, that's a large spine that comes out of the back of the abdomen. And when they use their feelers to feel around on the bark, when they come across the sound of a gnawing larva, they will probe with the ovipositor and pierce the bark and lay their egg in the larva of longicorn beetles. This is just an example of a longicorn beetle. Not to say that these ones parasitise this particular species, it's just illustrative, really. So, but also these are, they parasitise beetles. But if you think back to that burnet moth, it had orange thorax, and it had an orange head, but it had a black section of their thorax. Then it had black and white abdomen, long black wings. It seems to me that there's been some evolution for that burnet moth to copy the colours of this wasp so that it gets the shared protection of predators thinking it might be a wasp rather than a moth. That's just my conjecture. Now, this little fly is here, it's very, very common, I'm told, but because it's so small, it's rarely seen. But I've put it up because it feeds on grass. The larvae feed on grass. They mine the leaf, starting up on the leaf blade, and then travel down into the sheath where they can often hollow out the entire sheath before pupating. But it's just another example of the role that flies can play. They feed on the grass. Now, these three are examples of caddisflies. Now, caddisfly larvae can occur in a whole range of habitats, from fast-flowing mountain streams to freshwater ponds and dams. But the common factor is that their larvae are aquatic. Now, I don't know, I haven't been able to identify all these species, and I don't know what their larvae actually do, because some of the larvae have little nets attached to them that they filter things out of the water. Some of them, they have all sorts of different ways of living under there, but suffice to say that they're another one of the aquatic-based insects, as are the odonata that I've talked about. This is one of the damselflies, the smaller of the two families. The fundamental difference between dragonflies and damselflies is that one have internal gills of their larva and the other has external gills. But as adults, there's a generalisation that the damselflies like this one land, they're small and they land with their wings folded over the body, whereas the dragonflies are larger and they land with their wings spread out. Now, I've said that these are voracious predators and they can even predate their own. Now, this photo was taken in Vietnam, but it illustrates what I've just been saying. That's a dragonfly with its wings out, and it's actually predated a damselfly. They take all their food on the wing, so this little fella here is probably safe sitting on the leaf beside it. And in terms of predators, here's another one. These back swimmers are voracious predators. They'll take anything that they can get, mosquito larvae through to tadpoles or tiny fish. Now, I haven't been able to find out what sort of fish might use the dam in Woods Reserve, but I'm sure there are some form of small species of fish that may provide, in their very early stages, feed for these backswimmers. And unbeknownst to me, until I started looking into this, there's actually a moth that has a larva that's aquatic. And this is it. It's the pond moth, and these are found extensively across Australia. I've seen them recently up in the Kimberley on a recent trip. So they're spread right across the country. And this is their larva. They live they make themselves a little shelter. It's made of aquatic plants, but it's essentially like some of the moths do with their larvae, make little shelters on the ground, only this is under the water. And there's little fine protrusions from the larva. They're its external gills, which enable it to breathe underwater. Now that photo's not mine, that's taken from iNaturalist. It's an image from Geraldine and Steve Janik from Western Australia. I appreciate them posting it. It's the only time I've seen the larval stage of these moths. Now, these are interesting little moths. You wonder how they fly when you've only got little wings like this, but when they're flying, this forewing opens up and the hind wing opens up behind it. So they do have a much greater surface area to fly with, but they're tiny little moths, but they're likely to feed on hairy speedwill, a Veronica species. They start mining under the surface of the leaf, and then as they get bigger, they can come up onto the top. So they're a plant grazer. Tea tree web moth, as the name implies, feed on tea tree, but they also feed on paper bark and some other species of Myrtaceae. The larvae live in a communal shelter. It's got this sort of silken web, and they retain a lot of frass in there, which is just their excrement. It's dry pellets, and it sticks around. So you'll often see this clump of frass and vegetation and silk, and inside all that will be little cavities where a number of these larvae live together. Now, this is a really attractive moth. Very impressed to see it. This is a female, and I'll point this out because I've got something else to show later. This is a female. It's got very fine, thin antennae. The females don't have any need for the broad pectinate antenna, because the females are the ones releasing the pheromone. It's the males that are trying to work out where that pheromone's coming from, and that's why the males tend to have the large antenna. The males of this species actually look quite different to this, but their larvae feed on eucalypts. This is one of the tussock moths in the Lamantrinae subfamily, and the feature of these is that they don't feed as adults. Their proboscis, their horstellum or proboscis, has diminished that much. It's too short for them to effectively feed in any sort of nectar source. I'm not quite sure what the larvae of these feed on. And these I really like. They remind me of wearing a big fur coat. They're like a big woolly bear. They're one of the noctoids. Their name is actually makes sense. They're called the red spotted. So they've got red spots all over them. Unlike some names, they don't necessarily align with what you see. But red spotted Protoxia. They feed on native and introduced grasses and some herbs. So they feed on the smaller vegetation on the down near the ground, but plant feeders. And there's quite a few different species of emerald moths at Woods Reserve. They feed on a wide variety of plants, including wattles, tea tree, native cherries, Dilwinias, a whole range of things. But they're very attractive and they're very hard to tell apart. Some of them are quite readily separated, but others have very fine, subtle differences in this patterning across the wings, or the level of tinged colour, patterning of colour across the top of their head, and so forth. You've got to study them quite hard to separate some of them out. Now, this is really just here to illustrate the antenna. Both the males and females of this moth have these bipectinate antennae. Now, I'm pretty sure this is a male, but they fly around at night quite readily, and the males are generally more active, so it's more likely that you're going to see the males of these. But they're just they almost look more like an animal than an insect to me. When you see from this perspective, they almost look like they're a little mouse with long ears. They feed on trees or woody shrubs, including some of the eucalypt species. Now, these are best beetles, which we've got about 30 different species in Australia. They're commonly found in rotting logs, and you'll generally find adults and larvae living together in the rotting material. And the adults chew up the rotting vegetation and leave a soft pulp for the young ones to feed on. But this picture here shows a whole lot of mites, very small mites, clustered around the joints between the sort of armour plates of the beetle. And they had quite a loading on this particular one. But when I read up about them, it's quite common for these best beetles to carry a number of mites, which are presumed to be parasitic. Now, this is a click beetle that I referred to earlier. Their larvae are the wireworms that feed in the ground, and this particular one had this little insect attached to it all night, and that little fellow is a pseudoscorpion. They've got some venom. They're all predators. They feed on other invertebrates, and some species like this one obviously move from place to place by hitching a ride on a larger animal, and generally larger insects, and that's what this one was doing. This is a longicorn beetle that feeds underneath the larvae feed underneath the bark of a tree, and they can also be, the adults feed on the flowers and get their nectar, probably pollen. Yeah, they've got their chewing mouth parts, so they could probably eat pollen as well, but they can also potentially aid in some pollination. They feed on eucalypts and bassarias. And this is one of the spider wasps that move around searching for spiders to lay an egg on in their solitary nest, and they're often looking for huntsmen and the bigger spiders so that they can provide enough material for the egg to go through all its larval stages until it emerges as an adult. So I'm now quickly going to finish off with some predator-prey examples. We've got, this is the invertebrates, so we've got a spider that caught a fly, perhaps she'll die, spider that caught a moth, an ant that caught a termite, and an ant that caught a beetle. And then from a bird point of view, we've got crested shriketit eating a cicada that found under the bark. The eastern yellow robin, this time it's got some form of caterpillar, either a moth larva or a butterfly larva. There's a dragonfly being captured by a grey shrike thrush, and the bell miners with a bill full of psyllids or lerps. Then there's these predators, which is the sugar gliders that I talked about, and whilst they do eat a lot of plant exudate, and it's the level of plant exudate that exists through the winter time that probably sets their population limits. In the spring and summer, they feed on insects as well, particularly noctoid moths, scarab beetles, and some of these are swift moths of the Hepialid family. And then, of course, there's the yellow-tailed black cockatoo, which normally are feeding on seeds of trees, but they're also known to chase the larvae of these large moths. This is a mustard ghost moth, and then there's a couple of cossid moth species here. All of these have large larvae that feed in the bark of trees, under the bark of trees. And this is an example on the left here where the cockatoos have hacked into a seedling to get at one of those larvae. So that's a summary of what I've encountered with Woods Reserve and its fauna. It's just scratching the surface, but I find it really fascinating to explore just how these things fit together. Critically, you have to identify what the species is and then explore what role it plays, what it feeds on, and how it interacts with other things. But once we do understand a lot more about that web of life there, you're in a much better position to understand what the requirements are for protecting the habitat of the area. So the Peninsula Field Gnats, they meet in Frankston each month. They have a birding outing each month and a general outing where people look at plants and rocks and insects and birds and everything and anything that we can find on our outings. So there's the website. Hope you found this interesting. Thanks very much.